Thank, oh, excellent. Thank you, Rich. Thank you so much for joining us for our training on solar PV planning, zoning, and development. My name is Christine. I'm a regional environmental planner with the Naugatuck+Valley Council of Governments, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. So first, feel free to use the chat to say hello, share where you're from, and why you're interested in this training. We'll ask you to keep your mics muted for now. Questions can be put in the chat as we go along, or if you prefer to ask verbally, you can wait until the end. All questions will be answered at the end. As you hopefully just saw pop up on your screen, this meeting will be recorded. We'll post the recording and the slideshows to our online solar hub at nvcogct.gov/solar, and I will drop that link in the chat. We really encourage attendees to visit this hub that we've put together. It has lots of really great resources. So we hope you take a look and enjoy it. Finally, we will be holding another training on Wednesday, June 8th at 10 a.m. The theme for that one is permitting and inspection. And again, I am going to paste the registration link in the chat for anyone who has not registered yet. And so I just want to share a little bit about our organization. We are the Naugatuck+Valley Council of Governments, or NVCOG. We are the regional planning organization for 19 municipalities in West Central Connecticut and the federally authorized metropolitan planning organization for 15 of those communities. We coordinate planning and provide technical support and services to the region's decision makers. NVCOG is working with SolSmart to achieve a nationally recognized designation as a pro-solar region. And with that, I'd like to introduce Danny Falk to talk about SolSmart.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for the great introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining. Really excited for this planning, zoning, and development training. As Christine mentioned, I'm with the SolSmart program. I'm a program manager specifically with the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, which is one of the programs that helps run the SolSmart program. So I'm excited to see the great turnout today and hopefully a great training as well. And just to give a short introduction on the SolSmart program that Christine alluded to. We're a national designation program focused on helping expand solar development within regional organizations, cities, towns, counties, and all sorts of jurisdictions across the country. We have designated communities in 43 states, as well as the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We've just bumped up that number a little bit. And got our first designees in Wyoming and our first designees in Puerto Rico as well, which we're really excited about. But for a little bit of info about the program, I mentioned that we work on cutting what we call the soft costs of solar, and that includes everything from planning and zoning related costs, permitting and inspection related costs, engaging with communities, government operations, the whole 9 yards on that. Pretty much anything that isn't related to the cost of hardware of the panels themselves. We provide best practices for interested communities that want to work toward designation, and help communities put in those best practices to make the whole solar development process a lot easier. And on that front, we've been working with NVCOG for I think it's been about a year or so now, and working with NVCOG on a lot of those best practices. And one of those best practices happens to be helping to put on training for interested members of the community and other communities throughout the region. So excited to see this come together, and really excited to see the great turnout here. And if anyone is interested in having their individual communities or any other communities that they know of participate in the SolSmart program, feel free to send me a message in the chat or get in touch with Christine after the fact, and we can definitely hook something up where we can provide more in-depth information on your community. So with that, I'll throw it back over to Christine and we can get started. And thank you again to everyone for attending this great event.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danny. And I probably should just mention that although this was put together by the Naugatuck-Valley Council of Governments, we have lots of people signed up from all over Connecticut. We are thrilled to have you here. We still encourage you to visit the solar hub that we have for the Naugatuck-Valley Council of Governments. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us. So I just wanted to give a little introduction to our first speaker. So we'll have Kirt Maryland speaking first. He is the president of Reservoir Road Holdings, a renewable energy development and consulting firm. He has a very impressive resume of experience as an environmental attorney and as in-house counsel for energy firms. He is an Ivy League educated Fulbright scholar with a Juris Doctor degree and an LLM in environmental law. He is also a professor of renewable energy at UConn, where I was his student. So thank you so much to Kirt for joining us today. I will turn it over to you, and I am hoping you are just able to share your screen.
All right, thanks, Christine. Can everyone, you can hear me okay? Okay, all right, let me give it a shot here. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so you can see the NVCOG solar zoning?
Yes.
Okay, I'm actually a Google Meet guy, so I'm not totally familiar with Zoom, but let me try one thing before I start. What do you see now if I put that up? Do you see a map?
Nope, I'm just looking at the solar zoning.
Okay, good enough. I know I'm gonna have to unshare and share, but that's fine. Okay, so let me make sure I'm doing this okay. Yeah, so thanks for the intro. That makes me seem a lot more qualified than I am, but I do come at this from a little bit of a different viewpoint, because I was I considered I guess a developer for a long time in this industry, about 15 years, sort of running around. I was the guy who, found the land, did the cold call, and ushered the project through the permitting process and the interconnection process, and sold the project usually to one of 2 or 3 different groups, and then if I could try to keep the land. So I'm a current landowner of about 12 solar projects. And as Christine also mentioned, I do teach the subject at UConn, and I have been starting to consult with towns on the process that Connecticut recently developed, because it can get quite confusing. But so I come at it from a little bit of a different standpoint. I like to think a little bit more logical than from an advocate standpoint, one way or the other, because I've been on the development side and I've been on the town side also. And I think we're doing questions at the end, right, Christine, after Paul or after the end of mine, or how do you want to, should I entertain questions as I go, or?
I think whatever you're most comfortable with. We can have people put questions in the chat, and maybe if something seems super logical, I'll jump in and ask you. If not, we could wait till the end.
Yeah, I don't mind if people want to stop me. If I make a mistake, which I make a lot, they can stop me and correct me. I know there's a lot of smart town planners on the line, or we can wait till the end. I guess we can play it by ear. So as most of you probably know, I'm going to speak in particular about projects that are under 1 megawatt AC in size. And Paul is much smarter when it comes to siting council regulations than I am, but generally speaking, anything under 1 megawatt, anything over 1 megawatt in Connecticut, jurisdiction with respect to most zoning issues lies with the Connecticut Siting Council. So I was specifically asked to speak to local zoning. So I'm going to really address projects that are less than 1 megawatt that you might start to see in your town, or that you might want to address in your town zoning bylaw if you're not otherwise addressing solar at the moment. The other thing too is and Paul I think can attest to this, is the Siting Council will, as a town, I believe you're granted intervener status if upon request. And some of these things you put in your local zoning bylaw to address solar can be used as persuasive arguments for the Siting Council if you're opposing or supporting a larger scale project that's not necessarily in front of your zoning board. So Just to, you know, this is probably helpful for some of you, and some of you might think this is too elementary, but so what's a megawatt? A megawatt, and it used to be, gosh, when I started, we would allocate about 10 acres for a megawatt. And that would mostly be because the panels were a lot less powerful, and we didn't know as much about timing. So we had a lot of shade buffers and things like that. But these days, a megawatt AC, which is really 1.3 DC. And what does that mean? It takes up about 3.5 acres of land. And it's important you kind of understand the distinction, even as planners, the difference between AC and DC, and it's pretty simple. So the AC measurement, which is what the Siting Council works off of, I believe, and certainly Eversource works off of, is the power that's coming out of that box called the inverter right there. And to get 1 megawatt AC of power coming out of that inverter, you generally oversize how many panels you have. And usually it's somewhere between 30 and 50%. So you're gonna oversize your panels, which is really what you care about because that's your footprint, at about 30 to 50%, assuming 1 megawatt, you're gonna be about 1.3 or 1.5 megawatts DC, which, as I said, can be somewhere between, depending on the topography, about 3.5 to 4 acres. So we're gonna really be talking about those types of projects of 3.5 to 4 acres and below. And that's just a little grid of kind of how it works. But so most of what I'm going to talk about comes from experience in other states, in particular in Massachusetts, where they don't have a siting council. In Vermont, they do, but in Mass, all the jurisdiction is local, and they've learned the hard way over the last 15 years or so how to regulate these things. At the beginning, nobody discussed solar in their zoning bylaws, and now I would say virtually every town has a section dealing with solar. And what are the commonalities in there? Usually, there are some distinctions to start. For instance, behind the meter projects, meaning projects, think rooftops or projects that are meant to supply energy to a particular building and not just send the energy out to the grid, are generally favored, and in almost all the towns I've been in are considered as of right. Similar to very small projects, even if they're we call them standalone, if they're literally just putting power onto the grid, think 250 kW or a quarter of a megawatt and below, are generally favored just because of the lack of impact they have due to their size. And then you have a separate category which tends to be dealt with more severely and specifically, these standalone commercial scale projects. They could be called many different things, but think over 250 kW that just send power out to the grid. You know, the reasons for that are pretty simple. They're pretty obvious. It's solar is a distributed generation resource. The beauty of it, it can be put anywhere. And I think the idea that putting it on rooftops and parking lot canopies and creating, call it like a small microgrid where you're powering the building it's next to or on top of, is generally favored from a policy and an electric standpoint. Eversource very generally typically likes those because the power is being used on site, or at least most of it is, and not going out to the grid where they at some point might have to manage it. And from a town standpoint, these are just smaller. They're on rooftops and parking lot canopies and less visually impactful. So, you know, as you can see, this is just a sample of a zoning bylaw. As you can see, they treat them differently. Rooftop systems in this particular town were as of right in all the zoning districts. The accessory use, which I believe is their word for a behind the meter, meaning it's the system is supplying the building, is pretty widely accepted everywhere. And then as you get larger, you get in, you know, as you can see, there's a lot of Ns or PBs, which are planning board special permits in most of the zones. And they define, in this particular town, they define these things as we sort of talked about. They don't use the 250 kW measurement, but basically anything above 750 square feet that is not a behind the meter is going to go through the special permit process in town, simply because of the size and really the visual impact. So that's typically the way a lot of the Massachusetts towns, with the help of their regional planning councils, have developed their use tables dealing with solar. Some of them, I was in a town, some of them do solar overlay zones, which I'm not going to go into the detail on what an overlay zone is, as you're all planners, but you do see that from time to time, which in this particular state matches nicely with the state incentive program. But for the most part, they deal with them in their as another use in their use table. Now, one of the things that, it's a little bit outside of the scope of zoning, but I wanted to point this resource out, and I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second, and then I'm going to share again, because I think I need to do that to pull this screen up. Now, Christine, you tell me if you don't see the map here.
I see it.
Okay, so, most of you, probably like me, don't want to deal with electrical engineering, but since in the last 2 or 3 years, the states have made it quite easy to understand where solar facilities should go, or where developers should be looking to put solar facilities. And this is important because this is the starting point really for all developers once they understand the state program. And it's a really simple map, and Christine's going to share our slideshows. But so I pulled up this town right below Naugatuck on Route 8, and you can see, just based on the color coding here, these are all the color coded lines where all the 3-phase is. In those 3-phase lines, there's 3 lines on the crossbar, are really where all of your solar projects, say over 100 kW, are going to go. So if you're worried, for instance, about a solar project going over here, notwithstanding the bad topo, you're probably okay, because there's literally nowhere to connect. And if there's nowhere to connect, to build one's own line is extremely expensive. But you can either look at the legend here, or you can click on the line, and it's fairly easy to understand. At this particular site on Cherry Street, south of Naugatuck, it can take 3.4 megawatts AC of power. So if you're in the process of looking at where you want solar in your town, where you might think it's acceptable to put standalone solar, it might be worth just looking at where the 3-phase is, and in particular where there's current capacity. Now, I'm going to leave this here for you all to play with in your own time, but just know that this can change too. This green could turn to red. This red could turn to green, depending on projects dropping in or coming in or dropping out, or Eversource doing upgrades. It doesn't change overnight, but about every 6 months or so, we take a look at these maps and we see where there's new capacity or restrictions. So not exactly a zoning topic, but if you're it's a good point. It's a good place to start, just to understand how the developers see the world in terms of where they would want to start looking. All right, now I'm going to go back to my other screen, and I'm shooting for about a 10:30 close, right, Christine?
Yeah, but I don't think it's a big deal if you go a little over, so.
All right, now why am I having trouble finding oh, there it is, share screen, back to my main screen. Okay, now we're moving. All right, so I thought I'd just go through a quick set of issues that are unique to solar, and you're all in the planning world or the environmental world, so we are subject to everything that every other development is subject to: endangered species, wetlands, floodplain regulations, things like that. So I'm not going to go over those. We're not exempt. Some people think we're exempt from wetlands since we just put posts into the ground and we don't have a huge footprint, but we are subject to every regulation that every other development is out there. The unique ones for solar that I've seen that towns have to deal with are obviously the visual impacts. These can be big. On some of the siting council projects, you'll see they can go up to, some of them these days will go up to 5 megawatts. So think all in, depending on the topo, close to 20 acres of panel or 20 acres of footprint in your town. Typically in solar, especially when it comes to municipalities, they like to see some sort of guarantee of money being available to take the facility down if for whatever reason the solar company is not around and available to do so. And then simply due to the ease of these things going up into farmland, you're seeing a lot of farmland impact in the various states. So towns are building in restrictions on how much and what type of farmland soils these can go into. And then stormwater and taxes are two other significant issues you see pop up a lot with respect to ground mounted solar. So I like, this was a section, I'm not going to read it just because you'll have this slideshow on your own, but the visual impacts of the solar really vary. And it goes back to really the use table and where you want to see them. So if you're going to allow them by special permit in a residential zone, then you need some flexibility as planners on how to mitigate the visual impact. And I thought this particular section was specific enough, but vague enough to allow you some creativity in screening them. And it can come in various different ways. I mean, this in particular, this town allowed for a prettier fence with some evergreens on the outside to screen it. Now, I bring this up because one of the things you want to make note of is when you're talking about fences and distances from panels, you have to make sure you're always in contact with your electrical inspector, because in the towns I work in, this fence would not have passed the state electric code. And I'm not sure how they got away with it, but typically you're going to be required to put up a 6 to 8 chain link fence, or the solar developer would in some towns with depending on the voltage inside, with some barbed wire on top. But you can get creative if you give yourself enough flexibility in your bylaw to get creative with the fence line, and the electrical inspector's okay with it, you certainly can make the fences look more attractive. Some towns require this is obviously a chain link fence. And this was about a 20-acre site. They allowed for, they wanted the green sort of tennis court screening there, and then the shrubs. And in this particular town, this was step one, and they were going to do 2 different shrub lines, sort of staggered. So at full growth, you really wouldn't be able to see much of the facility from the road. And this was an old gravel pit, but having a flexible bylaw, but addressing the visual impact does give you the creativity to address particular neighbors' concerns and roadside concerns and things like that. And it can work. I mean, this was a solar field up in Hamden, Mass. Again, this was about a 4 megawatt, so it was pretty big. And this was, I just took this shot of Google Earth as you're driving up that Summers Road. You can see, at least from the little yellow man on Google Earth's point of view, you really can't see the solar field anymore as you're driving by it. So it's expensive. Developers don't like it, but if you're concerned about visual screening, certainly shrub lines and different types of fences done right can solve a lot of problems. The other thing that most people don't realize is with most large, I think all ground mounted solar projects require a connection to the grid. And this can be one of the most unattractive things about the project, because you have a new set of about 5 or 6 3-phase poles with various types of equipment hanging from it that will go out to your existing lines. And so some towns, and again, this is, some developers don't like this because it can be more expensive, but some towns are requiring that instead of this pole line, this is an example up in Sheffield, Mass, being there, that everything gets buried to the extent possible. And instead of the equipment being placed on poles, it's put on cement pads. Now, again, this is perhaps a negotiation with an applicant in your town and whether or not it's affordable. But again, these things are 45 feet tall, and they do have equipment hanging from it, and they're impossible to screen. So something that you might want to consider when looking at a project or developing a bylaw is to look at the actual infrastructure and how you can conceal that better. Decommissioning, I'm not going to say too much about it other than developers hate these things because they cost money. And in the world as it exists right now, there's very, very little possibility that even if a developer or a solar project owner were to go bankrupt, that a bank or a new buyer wouldn't come in and continue running it. So the possibility of a solar project in the current economic environment actually going belly up and not operating is slim to none. But that being said, some towns do want to prepare for the possibility that that happens. And even though they might require the developer to pull the project down if it's no longer operating, one can only guess that if they're bankrupt and have moved on, they're not going to do it. So they require a decommissioning surety, either a bond, cash escrow, some type of insurance policy. And again, that usually is revalued every 4 to 5 years. Because if you think about it practically, a lot of it is simply shutting the facility down, pulling the panels off, pulling the racking up, recycling the chain link fence. So it's a lot of civil construction type work, and those wages and prices can certainly change, every 3 to 5 years. So if this is a fairly good section, gave the town ample flexibility to impose a decommissioning bond or surety on the developer as part of the zoning board application. Yeah, and this is an interesting one is how big a site. I said about 3.5 to 4 acres per megawatt. That can depend. I mean, if your land is limited and panel prices are low, a developer might want to squeeze more into a smaller space. Now, there might be some row-to-row shading and some other negatives from that. But again, if the economics work, things can get squeezed. And sometimes squeezed together rows of panels don't look very nice from a town's perspective. So I've seen some towns have minimum lot size per, in this case, per megawatt, per kilowatt. So definitely something to consider as part of, if you're thinking of crafting a solar section of your bylaw, to put in some sort of minimum lot size, which obviously can have a direct effect on any stormwater concerns you might have. The less amount of panels on the more acreage, the more room there is for infiltration and assuming one lets the grass grow for that stormwater flow to be subsided. So that's the big one in Connecticut. If you Google solar, you're probably going to read a lot about the stormwater issues that are associated with solar, in particular for the larger projects that you're going to see more often at the siting council. But from a layman's perspective, which I am from a construction standpoint, most of the issues I've seen have to do with the following. Sometimes the incentive program or financial things like tax incentives sometimes disappear at the end of the year. One is granted as a developer a minimum amount, or say a year from final permit to build and get to commercial operation. And because of those incentives, developers are often forced to build in the winter, which is not good for them because it's more expensive, and not good for the town or the state or the environment. Because what it does is it opens a lot of bare ground up that gets frozen. And when we have those Connecticut winter rains come, there's really nothing that one can do to stop it, including often building basins for sediment control purposes as a first step. I've done a bunch of these, and even with the developer's best intents, it's hard to stop heavy rains on bare frozen ground from going in and over even the biggest, most well-constructed sediment basins. So to the extent possible, I would argue one could mandate or at least encourage the developer to build at a more sensible time of the year, i.e. spring, summer, or fall. And I know at the state level, at the siting council level, I should say the deep level, and Paul can correct me if I'm wrong, they're often forcing the larger developments to clear, plant, put the basins in, and then wait a full, if not 2 full growing seasons before the actual work begins to try to minimize the possibility of heavy stormwater runoff. So again, that's information that could probably be gleaned from your contacts at DEEP, but again, it's not necessarily a problem when they're up and operating, because these developers, at least in my experience, they mow 3 times a year. They let the grass grow, not up to the lower edge of the panel, but enough so that there's a lot of natural field-like erosion control that is there once they're operating. But during construction, certainly there have been a lot of stormwater issues throughout New England because of these sites. I'm just thinking, where am I? So farmland is really the last one. So farmland, you know, why is farmland and solar, why are they so connected? Because it's the cheapest place to put solar. You think about it, where would a big solar developer go if they want to do the minimal amount of civil work they could? It's cleared open land with no rocks. So, and we have a lot of that in Connecticut. Well, I guess not a lot. Maybe we should have more that is farmland. It's cheaper than forest land. It's cheaper than a parking lot canopy. So a lot of farmland has been aggressively sought after in New England in the last 10 years for these types of solar facilities. Without getting into the philosophical argument of whether that's appropriate or not, the way towns, in my experience, have been dealing with it is a bunch of different ways. One, they might limit how much of a farm, and they might define a farm differently. They might define a farm by its prime ag soils, by whether it's in some sort of tax abatement type farm program, but they might say no more than 20% of a parcel that's considered farmland can be used for solar. I've seen that. I've seen absolute restrictions for prime ag soils. You just can't go there. That's largely true in Massachusetts now, except if you're doing something like the picture, which is you're utilizing the solar field for a farming activity, which is a popular idea, but still not that widespread. But ideas of, whether it be sheep or meat chickens or crops, even shade tolerant crops under the panels, that's certainly an idea that sounds great, and it seems to be very popular, but in practice, you just don't see a lot of it. But it's an example for what, if you do see a solar project proposed for a farm, it's certainly an option to make it more compatible, or just in this case, an extra level of review and this happens at the siting council level often, that you've got to go to the Secretary of Ag, or in your case, if you had an ag commission at the local level, that if there is a project being proposed for farmland, that not only do they have to go through P&Z, but they've got to go through some sort of ag review also to make sure it's not overly detrimental to the farm industry in your town. So this isn't a zoning issue, but it's as Paul knows, this is a big issue in Connecticut, and it often is and I would say on the developer's behalf, making the impact of both the real estate taxes and the real estate for these solar projects tends to get reassessed after the solar goes up, along with the personal property taxes, the taxes that go with the equipment, making that clear from the start, both for the landowner's sake, the developer's sake, and the town's sake, is very, very valuable, because it often, if not, there is litigation out there between landowners and solar companies, between solar companies and towns, because the state hasn't been overly clear on what's exempt and what's not. But to the extent your town attorneys bless it, dealing with the taxes up front, and I said both the real estate and the personal property, can make for a much more successful, happy project in your town. And I bring this up, I'm in the middle of a project now that, if you can see, trying to understand the reassessment of the real estate on one parcel that's actually 4 different small projects is going to be challenging. So it's one of our arguments to the town, which is, why don't we sit down and work out some set numbers so the landowner knows what he's responsible for, the solar company knows, the town knows what they're getting, work with the assessors and make sure it's at the fair market value and try to do it via contract if the town attorney is okay with it. But another big sticking point is just taxes. So that's it. Big picture, you got to figure out where you want them in your town. They, contrary to many developers' statements, they don't create a lot of jobs. They are heavy on the job creation during construction. But once they're operating, the beauty of solar is, except for, annual maintenance, and then I said 3 times a year lawn maintenance, they're not going to create a lot of jobs. So if you have particular areas of town, business, industrial, that you want to keep for job creation, even though they might seem suitable for solar, you might want to rethink that. People love them in landfills, the natural buffers of played out gravel pits, brownfields, places where really nothing else would go are very appropriate spots, along with the rooftops and parking lot canopies and those small scale or behind the meter projects we discussed earlier. Just use resources. I mean, Paul's a good one. I'm sometimes a good one. The COGs are good ones. And you can always force a developer on a complicated project to pay for a third-party consultant for a town to do an analysis like this. It's a good option, especially if you're not familiar or comfortable dealing with projects like this, because we solar developers can be rather crafty at times. And that's a kind word. But on the flip side, working to understand with a developer the incentives at the state and the federal level, what type of timing pressure they might be under is a good thing, because it might be a project you want, and helping them get through on a good construction schedule so that they can take advantage of those state and federal incentives, which hopefully that means passing along some of that to the town in form of better taxes, is good for everyone. And again, even if these are smaller project issues we're talking about, they can be used if you're looking at a really big project coming into your town that you might feel somewhat helpless on, because the main jurisdiction lies with the siting council. And then I just threw in some bylaws from some towns in Mass that if you Google, or if you do a word search for solar, you'll see they've got pretty extensive sections dealing with solar in them. But again, most of the towns in Mass have through trial and error have put together fairly comprehensive sections dealing with solar over the last 5 to 10 years. And that is all I have, Christine.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry. Paul, would you be able to mute? Just get some feedback. Thank you so much. So I think we'll just save those till the end so that Paul is able to do his presentation. And there's just a couple of quick comments I wanted to make. One is that, Kirt has mentioned bylaws a lot. Bylaws is just the word for zoning regulations in Massachusetts. So anytime you sort of said bylaws, it's really regulations in Connecticut lingo, right? Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, I use them interchangeably. I apologize.
Okay, gotcha. I just know that in the Connecticut zoning world, we say regulations or regs a lot more. The other thing I wanted to mention is the idea of undergrounding power lines. And, he mentioned the aesthetic part, but I also wanted to mention it's great for climate change resilience. If those of you lived through the August 2020 power outage, where some of us were without power for 7 days because I think it was called Isaias, I'm saying that right, that big storm blew through and knocked down so many power lines. Burying them underground means that as we continue to have these frequent and intense storms, you don't have to worry so much about those.
Yeah, and the other thing too is it was a developers would cringe back in the day because of the cost implications, but nowadays, I mean, I've been on sites where they've chosen to go underground because it was gravel and it was cheaper. And as you said, it's less worry about trees falling on it. So it's not, if it's possible, it's not a bad option.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So I am going to turn it over to Paul. And then, like I said, I do see the questions in the chat. We will get to those at the end. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. Allow me a moment to introduce Paul. Attorney Paul Michaud is the managing, Michaud is the managing attorney and principal at the Michaud Law Group, a firm that represents select local, national, and international clients in all aspects of clean energy project development. He's worked with clients on a wide range of solar, microgrid, and electric storage projects throughout New England, the Northeast, and even the Caribbean. He received his Juris Doctor degree from New England Law Boston and a Bachelor of Science degree in finance from Bentley University. Paul, we are so glad to have you here, especially because you have worked on multiple projects in the Naugatuck Valley region. So we'll turn it over to you. Kirt, if you could stop sharing your screen, and then Paul.
Yeah, you know, I'm having some issues. I'm gonna sign off entirely, and then I'm gonna sign back in so I can get Paul on.
Okay. Thanks.
I don't know what's happening here. Yeah.
So, Christine, can everybody hear me? I just want to make sure my mic.
I can hear you. Yep.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm going to attempt to do the share thing. I can't guarantee. Let me see if hopefully I'll get this right. So I hit. Oops. Share. I'm trying to find. There it is. I think I did it. All right. Okay, so nice to meet everybody this morning. As Christine said, my name is Paul Michaud. I work at my firm. We're up to we're about to hit 4 attorneys. We focus exclusively on renewable energy, and including solar, well, really anything, solar, microgrids, and now what's big is storage, which is I'll talk about a little bit. But just to dive right in here, the main entities that I represent are either the solar investors. And as Christine indicated, I represent really large solar investors out of Europe, in the United States also, but I also represent a lot of municipalities. Through RFPs, and I'll stress I represent municipalities that want solar. So I'm definitely a solar advocate, either through solar investment. But I also represent a lot of towns who want solar, and I help them get solar and take advantage of the programs that are provided, through Connecticut policy, mainly through RFPs. So, this is all kind of here. This 100 megawatt is now probably closer to 200 megawatts, and I'm actually doing projects now in Africa. So. I do a lot in the Northeast, but now I have one in Nigeria and also in Republic of Congo, where they don't even have energy. So it's kind of a cool thing to bring, energy to villages that don't have it right now. So it's kind of neat. We're lucky here in the United States. But anyway, I do a lot of solar permitting. I kind of do the opposite of what Kirt was talking about. Kirt focused on 1 megawatt, under 1 megawatt. I would say all of my projects are 1 megawatt and up. For example, I'm working on a 100 megawatt project that's in your area. So it's in a gravel pit, so don't worry. But that's the largest that I'm working on in Connecticut is 100 megawatt right now. So. And I also do a lot of public policy legislative support. So my mission today is to talk about what's driving this and to give you sort of a big picture idea of why solar is coming to your town, how you can take advantage of it, or how, solar is like a double-edged sword. It could either be a really good thing for your town, or it could be something you're not really crazy about depending on where it's located, and that's where planning comes in. As Kirt indicated, under Connecticut statute, all projects 1 megawatt and larger have to go to the Connecticut Siting Council. under Connecticut law, Connecticut Siting Council preempts local. So for the most part, there are a few exceptions, but it basically preempts everything you do locally. So my advice on that level is it's very important. If there's a large project that you're either in favor or not in favor, or you want to help have some influence on, maybe modify things or create buffers, you want to have more of a, I would say, participation in the project. The important thing to do is you would automatically have standing, but you have to petition for that. So your town would get the notice. You automatically notice that a project's in your town and even nearby towns, but you would have to petition to intervene in the siting council proceeding in order to have, that gives you standing. And that's really important because it gives you a place at the table. And if at the end of the day you don't want the project but it gets approved, it does allow you to appeal it. And if you don't have standing and you don't intervene, you have no power at that point. So I find in the projects I work on, and it was mostly on, to be completely frank, it's been on, the side of the solar investor. It worked well because when the town intervenes, they tend to work very closely offline, and it makes for a better project for everybody because there's more participation by the town. And with the solar, the solar developers not sometimes don't know the sensitivities of a particular town. So it works very well if you get a seat at the table. And again, above megawatt, we have to go to siting council. There are exceptions. For example, the picture here above, let's see which one. I'll just jump ahead. So this picture, this is in Bristol, city of Bristol. This one is under a megawatt. Bristol, so it would technically go to local permitting. Bristol did have zoning that prohibited solar, but they were the beneficiary of virtual net metering. So when I worked with the city of Bristol, they wanted the project. So what we did was you can petition the siting council to give you jurisdiction even if you're under 1 megawatt. And the city did not, they supported it. So this could have been a local, but we ended up going to the siting council basically to get around the town's own restriction that they didn't want to have for this project. So it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of, you can do a lot of things within the statute to overcome certain things. Kirt mentioned, projects that need a letter from ag or deep for forest. That under the statute, that's for projects 2 megawatts and above. So you'll see many projects in Connecticut that are 1.99 megawatts, because with that, you actually can go to siting council but not require the support letter from the Department of Ag. So it really pays to have whoever represents you make sure they really know the statutes for siting council. It's really important because there's a lot of different avenues you can go. So they really need to know those statutes well. So what I'm going to talk about now is the drivers. Why are these larger solar systems coming to your town? It's public policy. So, and I know the state is grappling with it now, the benefits versus, and the environmental benefits versus detriments, right? The policy of Connecticut right now is the state wants to have 100% carbon-free energy generation, 100% by 2040. And the only way to do that is to have a lot of solar systems, have hydro, on offshore wind, things like that. I don't think you're going to see a lot of fossil fuel gas-fired plants being built in Connecticut. So, and then there's also a concern about Millstone. And I think the idea is, as Millstone, the nuclear power plant, closes down and the older power plants, fossil fuel plants, close down, the idea is to replace them with this type of, with solar and hydro and wind. And in order to help promote that, Connecticut right now has two major programs on the books. One is called the Non-Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program, which I'll talk about right now. Shorthand, it's called NRES, and I'm going to try to stay away from, the acronyms, but the Non-Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program, that's an active program. We just finished the first auction. It's so it's a 6-year program. Starting in January, the auctions will be twice a year. So I'll explain on the next slide exactly how it affects you, but there is a provision in the statute that does benefit municipalities. It replaced the old virtual net metering program, which is now sunsetted. It's now called SAM, and what SAM stands for is State Agricultural Municipal. So it depends where you stand. I work with a lot of municipalities that actually want this. They want solar in their town, and they know it's going to come to their town. So they want to take advantage of it because it benefits the town on many levels, which I'll talk about. I'll go to the next slide. So here again, these are pretty complicated programs. So I'm going to keep them really high level. But I just want to let everybody know who's on, feel free, if you have any questions on these programs or on anything with the siting council, feel free to give me a call. It's just as a courtesy. I'll be glad to talk with you, offline, informally as a courtesy. Again, I just want to let you know my phone number's here, and because I am hitting this at a high level, we could talk about this for 4 or 5 hours. I don't have that long, so I'm really keeping it high level. So, there's two pieces to the non-residential renewable energy solutions program, and which is with SAM. There's the one on the left really applies to the people on this meeting. So it's the SAM program, and it's called Buy All. And Kirt talked about standalone projects. These are projects that stand alone in the field, for example, or at a gravel pit, or or even in a forest that's trimmed. So these are the standalone projects, and it's called Buy All. And the only way to have these type of projects now in Connecticut, other than the other program I'm going to talk about, is if it's matched with a SAM entity, which means, for the folks on the phone, it's got to be matched with a municipality. And what happens is, for example, I'll use a 1 megawatt project. The production of that 1 megawatt project, say it produces 3 million kilowatt hours in a year, right? You have to match that to municipal facilities, for example, the school, the town hall, water treatment plant, anything like that. And so those accounts get the usage of those accounts get matched 1-for-1 to the production of the system. We're not allowed to build a system that's bigger than your accounts. So it's really important. A big benefit of this new program is that, unlike the old program, which was limited, here, if you have a town, and even if you have solar already, it's okay. You can combine all the accounts in your town, up to 1,000 bills. So your entire municipal facilities, up to 1,000 facility bills, you can combine that into one account. And you'd be surprised how big that gets when all the little ones are added up. And that can be applied to a solar system, a standalone solar system under the SAM program, which has to be competitively bid. And what that benefits the town, because what happens is whatever the bid is, and I'm going to keep this really high level, you basically get a hedge because you get a portion of the revenue, or we call it a grant, from the system for 20 years. You get it quarterly checks for 20 years. And we did like eight projects in the last round. And if we win, and we think we have a good chance, my client, it's going to bring millions of dollars of savings to the towns. There is sort of a dark side to this, which you need to know, and it affects you as planners. You could have a solar system, for example, 1 megawatt or even a 5 megawatt in your town. That's a SAM that's going to help a municipality, but not your municipality. What could happen is, as long as it's in, for example, Eversource territory, you could have a solar system, again, in your town that's actually helping a town on the other side, a city on the other side of the state. So that, there's kind of a double edge to that. And that's why I'm finding that a lot of towns and cities are saying, wait a minute, if we're going to build it in our town anyway, we want the benefits, not just the tax benefits. We want to get the revenue, the grant benefits for 20 years. So I'm kind of seeing that. I'm seeing that as a trend with towns. And another trend I'm seeing is because it produces so much revenue, I have towns now that are actually owning the systems because the revenue from the system for 20 years is actually paying for the system. And so they're taking out, it's called TELP loans, tax exempt lease purchases, which I think is like 1.9%. So the towns are able to reap a lot of savings, and actually from like 100% of the savings really from the solar system by actually owning it, which is interesting. This new program lends itself to that model. So you don't have to do that, but that's how you get the most benefit. The other way to do it is just basically, work with a solar investor who would own it and all that good stuff. So the right-hand side of this screen is the more traditional piece of the program that Kirt talked about. It's called netting. Here, what happens is the solar system's on your rooftop of your town hall, for example. And so it serves the town hall. Whatever is produced that the town hall doesn't need will go into the grid and will make money that way based on how it's bid into the auction. So that's the more traditional approach, kind of like net metering. Left side is the standalone project, which I mainly, work on and do RFPs for, on either for solar investors or for towns. And again, I'm available. There's a lot more detail, but I'm going to keep it at that level for the purposes here. So that's that program. And just to go back a little bit, so this was under the old V&M, but this was a City of Bristol project. They took 4 projects, and just to tell you how well it works, they're saving they're going to end up with $5 million over 20 years. This was one of the projects, and these were other projects in Putnam, I believe, that were helping the City of Bristol that I worked on. I just want to show what they look like. These are all 1 megawatt projects. So that's kind of what a 1 megawatt looks like. So that's the NRES, or the non-residential program. And again, the next auction's in January, and then they'll have another one in June. These auctions are going to produce the projects that will likely end up being proposed in your town. And you'll know about it. Siting Council generally requires pre-application meetings. So if a developer shows up at your table with a larger project, they're doing that to introduce it to you, but they have to go to the siting council. And again, that's where we go back to, you may want to get really, if you're not already, up to speed on how the siting council works to make sure your town has a say in the project. The other major program is the Shared Clean Energy Facilities program. It's very similar, but it's similar, but more simple than the other program. This program is once a year, usually in January. We just finished the 3rd year of it. It's a 6-year program. This program includes, what happens is, this is 100% standalone projects. These are the projects that you'll see in a field, like for example. These projects are bid in as a bundle product, the RECs and the energy. It's competitive. The winning projects get to build their project. All the energy goes into the grid directly, goes right to Eversource. So under this program, the town, other than getting pretty substantial property tax, grand list income, won't benefit the town directly, where the NRES program can. So that's the distinction here. This program is made to go to the utility directly. They take it and allocate it. They do allocate it to some towns, low income, people who can't put solar on their rooftops. And that's all administered directly by the utility. They take the energy and do that. So there's more to it, but that's kind of the high level thing on the SCEF program. Now I'm going to quickly switch to what happened at the legislature. So these are the two main programs. Legislature, in this session, with Public Act number 22-14, was signed by the governor in May. It greatly expanded these programs. So you're going to see a lot more projects. We went from, it did two things. Like for example, this programs went from 85 megawatts capped to 160. They almost, they more than doubled. They more than doubled. And the size of the projects basically went from 2 megawatts to 5. So you're going to see larger projects now in your town if they fit, right? It's up to 5, but it's larger, and so those are the main. So those are the big increases. I didn't list it here, but last year they passed a battery storage program, incentive program. You're going to see, from a planning perspective, I know we're talking a lot about solar, but I guarantee you're going to see a lot of solar that's going to be coupled with a battery storage facility. So when you're working out, your planning, be ready for that. You're going to see a lot of battery storage. They have small footprints, but it's a different type of technology. We're talking about batteries in chemicals. So I want to make sure you're aware of that. You're going to see a big, a lot of that come through. And what that does, that allows these projects to basically run 24/7. You can fit them. Kirt talked about capacity on the line. For example, we're working with Eversource now, where you can actually pair a battery with solar. And once we get this finalized with Eversource, the solar system will generate during the day and give a lot of the energy to the battery storage. And at night, the battery will basically dump energy into the grid, into that same power line at night. So you're seeing a lot more of that. just really quickly, you know, I am very much pro solar. For towns, especially. Again, I think that the NRES/SAM program is can be beneficial to towns because you'll receive payments over 20 years for the revenue a portion of the revenue derived from it, and it makes a great hedge against the rising prices. As everybody knows, the energy prices are going up like 4 cents in the next week or two, or more, because of what is happening in the Ukraine. You're going to see a huge spike in your bills. This program, it would actually help hedge against those increases. And again, the whole purpose of the program is the state, as well as probably the world, is shifting away from dirty, you know, and dangerous, really, fossil fuel fired generation to the clean generation, where you don't have that gas component. This table is showing an example of, now that we've increased the project to 5 megawatts. This is an example based on the current market. I used a current project that we bid into the last auction. If this project was bid at 5 megawatts under the agreement that, and I'm not going to talk about the town, but that the town had, they would save $6.5 million. And it would cost the town nothing. There's no risk. It's owned by the developer in this case. So that's how that works. And on the right side, this shows the environmental benefits of a 2 megawatt project, which is the big purpose, right, under climate change. Again, these are the benefits. Again, I'm focused exclusively on towns. There's no expenses if you were to participate. You pay your electricity like you always do. This is separate. It doesn't change your contracts, your competitive contracts. Unless you choose to own the project yourself, all the costs are borne by the developer. Unless you choose, for example, to do a TELP loan, where it's basically a turnkey project is built for you. And again, the whole point is to shift away from to more clean power. And that concludes my high level, basically summary of the 2 programs that are generating the projects that you will see in your town. And like Kirt, I'm available to ask any questions, or now or even later if you have more detailed questions. And I thank you for listening.
Paul, thank you so much. I'm just going to ask you to mute.
Yep, I can figure that out.
I'm going to go ahead and do that. There we go. Okay, so you should be all set. Sorry, just a little feedback. Thank you so much. So I did want to ask a couple of questions that were in the chat here. So David asked during Kirt's presentation, he said, recently a solar array was built in Bloomfield. In order to skirt the 1 megawatt threshold, the developer divided the parcel into 2 parcels and split the grid so that each parcel did not trigger jurisdiction for the siting council. Is there a way to legally prevent this from happening?
So 2 separate parcels, 2 separate interconnection points would be considered, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, 2 separate projects. Now that's sort of, I mentioned that the developer craftiness, that's classic. That was done in Massachusetts over and over to skirt, actually to take advantage of better incentives for smaller projects. And eventually, I'm off topic here, but the state banned projects on adjacent parcels or within a certain distance of each other. So that sort of gaming of the system could not take place anymore. I don't know of any rule in Connecticut that would prevent that, Paul, similar to what Massachusetts did to prevent that type of gaming, where you, instead of a 1 megawatt on one piece of land, they separated it up into, say, 2 450s on 2 different pieces of land with 2 different interconnections? I don't think there's anything in Connecticut stopping them from doing that, right? Oh, you're on mute.
No, right now there's nothing that could stop that would stop that. If there's separate projects on 2 separate pieces of land, they have separate interconnection. You can do that. Again, that's a perfect example of where I believe the siting council would see that, and probably, if they were made aware of it, and force them to go before the siting council. Based on my experience, because if it's the same owner and they're contiguous parcels, they may see that they may interpret the statute as that, to pull them in, or at least try. So
you're saying it would be worth kind of informing the siting council if you see that happening as a town planner?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. It's just an informal call. They're very easy to work with at the siting council, and they'd be interested in hearing that. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid. It's not good for solar. So.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we have another question here from Hiram. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It says, Kirt, any experience locating these solar panels in floodplains? Is it a bad idea?
So my understanding, and I've done this a few times in floodplains, actually in a brownfield in a floodplain, is the primary concern is not that, for instance, the river will spill over the banks and there'll be 2 feet of water up to, nearly the lower edge of the panel. The primary concern is that the water will get into the underground conduit, and somehow that water will make its way back up into the important infrastructure like the inverter and transformer. So as long as it's well constructed, and the conduit is sealed and you have the right electrical installers, for the most part, building in a floodplain, taking away the environmental sensitivities from a construction standpoint is possible. And one of the reasons is we don't, there's not a lot of fill. If you're not bringing in a lot of fill, the actual posts are taking up very little space. And so the only net add to the floodplain is just the posts in that cement pad. So compensating, so you meet that general category of no net fill can be quite easy for a solar facility to get to. So yeah, no, it's definitely a possibility. Unlike a wetland, if it's not wet, if there's no endangered species overlay zones, building in a floodplain is certainly possible, done right.
Thank you. And I guess we'll, at this point, we can, that's all the questions in the chat. So if anyone would like to simply unmute and ask a question, you could feel free to turn your camera on, or anyone who has any questions for either of them.
And like Paul, you can, I think my email's up there too. They can email me or Paul afterwards too with any specific questions.
Okay, I guess we're not seeing any other questions. So I want to thank so much our 2 wonderful presenters. Very, very much appreciate your time today. As we mentioned earlier, everyone should keep an eye on their inbox. We'll be sending you a link to a recording of this along with the slideshows, which will have the contact information for our presenters today. We hope that you will use that link we put at the top of the chat here to sign up for our presentation training of next week as well, which will focus on permitting and inspection. Again, that's Wednesday, June 8th at 10 a.m. And thank you so much for everybody who joined us today. Have a wonderful day. Take care.